For this one, we're going to first enter my Patreon in the chat. And for those interested, they can check out that. Go to the address listed. And it's also in the bottom of the description if you check out this later than what it is right now. And for this one is basically we're going to answer a very, very tough question. Does Trump want to actually lose in 2020? Because we know that he, as his big ego, he does not want to actually give up and step aside and say, I'm not going to run in 2020. And because it's been too much stress during the actual whole first term, because they've been running just constant negative press on him day in, day out. And he was not expecting that. He was expecting somewhat of a negative press, but he was not expecting as much as they did. And if you look at it, he's basically, if you look at what he's done, he promised to get rid of these neoconservatives around him and started bringing more people that were being a little more pro-liberty. And if you look at what he's done, he's essentially just surrounded himself with nothing but these swamp creatures and people who've been there their whole lives and who are essentially just totally entrenched into everything. His attorney general was actually on board with Jeb Bush. Now, if you should know something with what happened with the Mueller report, you should realize with Mueller and the whole Russiagate thing, you should realize where Russiagate actually started. Russiagate did not actually start really with the on the Democratic side. It actually started on the Republican side. Now, you had a couple of people who were actually paying for this. Number one was actually people like Bill Kristol and other neoconservatives. Bill Kristol, John Bolton, amongst other ones. They were linked up with the, let me figure out the actual name of the magazine. Forgot the name of the publication offhand. The Weekly Standard. And it was basically people involved in the Weekly Standard. And so those people were essentially, there are a lot of big names within that. Specifically, those two were some big names involved in this. And those were ones that were actually supporting Hillary Clinton. Now, who was also involved with it was actually a campaign. Now, this campaign was from the top, and this would have been one that was set up by Jeb Bush. Now, if you understand who Bob Barr is, Bob Barr was actually a big supporter of Jeb Bush. So essentially what he's doing, he essentially put in someone who actually does not like him. And he essentially put in, that's one person he put in. Another one, as we talked about with the National Security Advisor, this is a person who was basically going to be put in as that position because he could not get support for any other position within the actual government. He essentially, the reason why he was put Undersecretary of the UN before was because he could not get security clearance anywhere else. And that's John Bolton. John Bolton can't get security clearance anywhere else because they know what he is like. They know he has no actual legitimate foreign policy experience. And they know that this to be true. And when the only way to actually sneak him in there, they know with the Bush administration, that was the only way to sneak him in there was the Undersecretary of the UN. And that was the only way they could have snuck him in there, was basically a way to get him in without having to receive a vote. And that's the only way to get him in and get him under there without having to go through all of these hurdles. And he's another person that actually was going to get this position by Hillary Clinton. He was a Clinton supporter. and just like Bill Kristol is. These people are neoconservatives. They wanted a neoconservative in there. Now, if you start to look at other people around him, is even Pompeo, his original CIA person, and moved over to the Secretary of State. Now, you should understand that he did not even through any portion of the campaign back Trump. He was actually backing other neoconservative candidates and was only backing Trump after Trump was the nominee. And that was only after he got backed into a corner that he would basically have suffered so much backlash that if he would have backed anybody else after Trump was named the nominee. And he was not doing, even after being named the nominee, he was not doing anything actively to actually support him. He was just saying, okay, I'll vote for him. That was it. And that was the only support that Pompeo gave him. And we look at this because Tucker Carlson has actually brought up the actual point, which is actually kind of a legitimate point, because it almost looks like he doesn't want to actually continue on being president, but he doesn't want to actually kind of step aside. Now, obviously, we do not want a person like Mike Pence. Now, people go, "Oh, but Mike Pence is a nice guy." He might be a nice guy. I'm not doubting that. But the thing is, Mike Pence is another neoconservative and still fits in the same boat. And that's the whole problem. And that's a lot of where you're getting a lot of these people coming right in. And when we had Mattis at the Pentagon, that was essentially the same problem. Now, he was able to get rid of Mattis, but by having a person right below Mattis, it's the acting secretary, is doing exactly the same bidding. And when we start to get these people are saying, well, you're not really interested in doing any of these things that are actually, a lot of these people that are starting to duck out now are saying, well, you're not really interested in doing any of these decisions that are being pro-liberty. You're just kind of going along with whatever these swamp creatures want. And he had plenty of opportunities, as we see if we look at the budgets that went through, to actually do vetoes and then say, I want the border money for the border to be on the budget, and we're going to cut out money from certain areas to make sure that this is secured. And he could have done this. He could have, if he wanted it, he could have put it through both sides on the budget. Now, if we look on the Pentagon, we can actually look on. We can actually see that a report from December of 2016, which would have shown 2015 waste, would have actually shown that about $125 billion. Now, if we look at the 2015 budget, would have been, you would have seen the actual amount, and that you would have seen it'd be about 598.5 billion. Now, when we do that, you would see it be about approximately about 21% waste. So when we're seeing that, we should actually look to reduce. That should mean that right there you have about that for being waste. Now, this means, and this was a high time for actually military intervention, and this is what we saw as waste. Now, that means the 598.5, we should be able to minus about 125 from it, and this means we only need about this means we would only need approximately about 473.5. This means we're still doing exactly what we're doing currently, and this means the actual budget would actually be about $473.5 billion. All we're doing is we're eliminating waste from the actual department. And that would be what we would have. Now, what we see right now is we see a budget that is near, what we have, $750 billion that is wanted, I believe. If not a little more than that. I believe that's what they're currently asking for, somewhere around there. And that means you're talking there's about another 276.5 billion. Now this means you don't even have to change policy, and you can pretty much guarantee that this is going to be that amount of waste. And you can guarantee that you're probably going to have somewhere around a 37% waste. Because why? Because we know that all that is excess money, and they know if they don't spend it all, it's going to be it's going to have to be returned. And when you show that you don't need that much money, it shows that goes back. Now, we looked at some of the other things as we see some of the actual policies. We see the idea of backing essentially a violent socialist in Venezuela that's actually starting to lose rapidly support, even with the U.S. backing him. That's Juan Guaido. And we see that over in actual other socialists. Now, we see this as basically repeating the mistakes of initially what we had in Iran. Now, basically, this means we're just trying to establish a puppet. And this is something that we're finding out there. And this is something that's very, very important to understand. And we need to understand this as a major factor. And we need to understand what's actually going on. Now, when we look at now you gotta understand that with all this is, I will bring as a caveat that I did vote for Trump because I did not want Clinton winning in the last election, because I wanted us to stay out of war. Now, if Trump is going to essentially back all the people that Clinton was going to put in the cabinet, well, I don't know what I'm going to be doing next election. And because it seems like he's essentially making Clinton's cabinet for her. And the only difference is the actual person at the top, who seems very, very disinterested in what's actually going on. So it seems like the cabinet has been running everything. The only difference is the budget manager and Mick Mulvaney seems to have basically fallen asleep at the wheel, and he's not exactly doing anything to say no on these budget things. He doesn't really seem to have the guts to basically say no on these budget points and say we're not extending out these things, because when we look at the waste of the Pentagon, we're not extending out the Pentagon's money, because frankly the Pentagon has shown that it does it comes back every single time with these with its very, very, even very, very limited audits, and it fails every audit. And it fails it by basically showing that at least minimum 20% of waste. And you're talking, and it's every single time. And you have basically is neoconservative think tanks try to go, no, that they didn't really waste it, and like AEI is a basic neoconservative think tank, is they try to basically say that that money didn't go to waste. Well, the fact is that's a lie. Is every time we end up finding it is basically that they waste more and more money. And when they find the last 28 billion, that was on top of what the previous ones have actually found. And these are only in addition to, and when we actually, and it ends up going back to a basically a use it or lose it type of thing. And we find, like, right here on Military Times from March 12th, is DoD dropped 4.6 million on crab and lobster and $9,000 on a chair and last-minute spending spree. Right there. And that should show you right there what they're doing. And this should show you right there is what they're actually doing. And it should show that basically that they're actually spending excess amounts of money. That they're spending money on steak, on lobster, on crab, and this is what's going on this. And that they're spending extra money on these contracts to basically making sure that money goes out, and that basically it's on a basic use it or lose it system. They know if they don't spend that money, the money goes away. And what this does is this creates a bunch of waste. And this is why when you get these neoconservative think tanks like AEI, amongst others, they go, oh, no, that wasn't wasted money. You mean these people have to have crab, lobster, and steak? And it's not just like cheapo steaks. We're talking top of the level steaks. We're talking that they're going prime level steaks. Which is the highest grade, and they're only going from either the rib primal or the short loin primal, and which is basically the short loin primal is T-bone porterhouse, which those differ depending on the amount of the fillet or tenderloin, if you want to go from the full cut that they're getting on it, and then also the strip steaks or fillet, depending on if they break it up, and then also the ribeyes from the rib primal, and they're doing this for steaks, and they're spending money on snow crab, they're spending money on it's shown crab cakes, they're spending money on lobster, and to me, I don't think this is the normal expenditure, because this is not exactly what you should be spending a lot of money on, because that's showing that they're basically just trying to send money out to get a lot of stuff back. And we've known agencies to even buy outdated equipment and buy a lot of it just to actually get rid of money. And this has been what's been done in the past. And it shows that he's not willing to cut money, because he knows that that if he does this, then the Pentagon starts whining. And we know that you could basically cut at least a fifth of the Pentagon and have would have no actual impact on their actual policy. You can cut 1/5 of the actual money, which means that you can actually do that would allow for a lot of things into dealing with the actual budget itself. Now, when you're talking you're $1 trillion over budget, I think on an average per year that he's going, I think that you need to seriously look into that, because when you're spending over $100 billion extra that you need to start looking into that, and you need to start cutting out waste, and you need to start looking into all these areas. And if you start doing that, you're going to realize that you can actually start cutting out a lot of this waste. And he's not looking into that. He's basically going, okay, we're gonna take stuff out of all the other departments, but we're gonna give the Department of Defense this huge budget increase. No, you should actually be looking at cutting them down to roughly about, if you want to keep the same policy, okay, you can go down to about $450 billion a year. If you want an actual policy of just defense, which means getting out of NATO, which means telling the UN we're leaving, and actually telling the UN we're leaving, getting out of NATO, and having no entangling alliances around the globe, and we're just going to be dealing with defense of the United States and its territories, you only need about 250 billion. That means right there with the defense alone, we could be saving about $500 million a year. We can actually nickel and dime the other $500 million just by actually being going through waste, and that would actually balance the budget right there. You would actually break even right there. You wouldn't be adding a damn penny to the actual budget. Now when you start to go through and you could start cutting out programs that are not necessary, now you can actually go through and say, okay, for let's say cut out public aid for everybody who's not on disability. Start doing that. Start basically going through and cutting public aid for everyone who is not on disability. Say we're going to rely solely on charity. Work this through the actual points. And you're going to do that. You're going to actually go through and you're going to do some things that are actually going to help out the poor, such as ending the Federal Reserve, which he has not addressed. This is something that he actually talked about in his actual campaign. Now, he has not even addressed that. He's even what he called thought about actually doing more quantitative easing. This is one thing he's actually brought up recently. This is exactly what actually got us into the actual problem to begin with. Now he's actually going the opposite direction what he actually thought, what actually people voted him in for. People voted him in for because he was actually the first one on stage of a general election debate to actually mention auditing the Federal Reserve. And yet he's gone through most of his first term and he has not even gave it an actual thought. He's when it comes down to actually things that would actually end famine around the globe, such as stop arming the Saudis in this war in Yemen. He's not done that. This would actually be something they would actually try to establish peace, and he's not done that. He's actually vetoed that. When it comes down to that, he's tried to basically go with trying to establish an emergency on the southern border, completely ignoring the actual implications of concentrating more power in the executive. He's basically used more military power out of the executive when he bombed Syria, when there was no actual evidence of them using gas. And we found actually recently that it was actually the rebels who were actually being trained by the actual people in by our actual own government. And these were the people, a mix of that and a mix of the white helmets, who you had who actually received a Nobel Peace Prize, who are actually faking events as well, and telling people to run into telling a lot of the people to run into like hospitals and stuff and screamed that they were gassed when nothing ever happened. And on top of that, we also have the recent event that's where he's declaring the Iranian military of being a terrorist organization when they've never invaded anybody. Now, if we're going to look into the fact of if we're going to declare state militaries for ones that have actually invaded, we would actually, the only ones that would actually be under that thing would basically be the ones who've actually participated in the overthrow of Gaddafi. That would be the U.S. military as well as the other ones involved in NATO. That would be the cases of the ones involved in the Syrian war. That would be as well trying to overthrow Assad. That's UAE. That's Saudi Arabia, and that would be Israel as well, because those were not invited. as well as the United States, and those would in addition to the United Kingdom and France. And these are the ones that would basically, those are the basic ones that would, the U.S., the Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, United Kingdom, and France. Basically, those six should actually be the ones that they should be declaring as terrorist militaries, because of the fact that they're invading sovereign nations. And we can have more evidence of that because we have Saudi Arabia with Yemen. Yemen is actually not a Sunni nation. It's actually a Shia nation. If you look at the case of the Golan Heights is not the land of Israel. It's actually native land to Syria. And we can see that back in 1981 they actually annexed it, and that is illegal under UN law. And we need to understand this, because the fact is that would be an actual terrorist act. And we can actually declare that with those people, with these groups. Now, and actually we can see that they've actually stolen goods from those people. Now, if you want to actually remove from those who've actually stolen goods from those people, from ones who have not, okay, then you can actually minus off the US and the UAE. Okay, let's minus those two groups. You can actually will minus off the UK and France as well, because they have not stolen goods either. But what you do have is you do have two groups who have stolen goods, and those are and who have directly supported terrorism, and been under terrorism themselves, been directly terrorizing groups themselves. That's Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia directly supports has directly supported the caliphate. This is their military as well. They've actually armed Al-Qaeda in Yemen themselves, and as well as in Syria, as well as the U.S. government did as well with it, but they can claim, we'll give them the claim of ignorance in that case. Now, we cannot give that claim to Israel, because we had statements by their defense minister, and we still have them doing it to this day, that their defense minister made the statement that they'd rather have ISIS than Iran. And this is a thing that their defense minister is still in power. Now if they actually had a problem with this, their defense minister would have actually been removed. And they would have actually said, sorry, you gotta go. We cannot have you in power. We cannot allow you to be in power if you're going to make statements like this and still be in actual power of our military. We cannot have this. And if this is going to be the case, then we're going to remove you from power, and we cannot allow this. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand. They go, oh, Israel's the ally of the U.S. Well, you can't have an ally, you can't be allied with a country that's going to be basically supporting a group that wants to take your country out. And that's not what an ally does. They've also been a group that does not, they've also a country that does not support the freedom of speech within our country. They don't support allowing BDS within our country. BDS is basically nothing more than a group that does not support the policies of Israel as a nation with basically their actions on Palestine. So what they believe in is basically boycott, divesting, and sanctioning. And they're nothing more than a group that supports this. Now, this is not an anti-Semitic group. This is not a violent group. This is actually a group that extends across political lines. Now, what they do is they go, okay, we're going to pump a bunch of money through lobbying into Congress to essentially ensure that people are not going to be allowed to voice their free speech. And so you see a lot of these laws go through Congress of anti-BDS legislation. This means if you have a government job, even just a teacher, if you're a teacher in many states, basically about 2/3 of the states of the union, you cannot be affiliated in any such way of a BDS movement group. This means if you don't share the beliefs that Israel is this benign country, regardless of what they do, regardless if they shoot Palestinian medics in the face, regardless if they shoot journalists in the face, because they don't want any information to go out of their country, because they are socialist, and they'll use snipers to basically make sure this happens. I mean, there have been stories within the last week or so that have actually gone out where they actually shot so close to an actual journalist that they actually hit the guy's camera lens, nearly basically shooting him in the face. And we have stories of them shooting medics and killing the medic when the medic was trying to take care of an injured Palestinian civilian. Now you have to understand that Palestinians aren't just Muslim. A lot of them are Christian, and this is the whole thing. They're basically killing. They're killing just as much as they're killing Muslims. They're killing Christians. And you need to understand this about Israel. They're not just doing that. And when they're going after Iran, Iran is not just a Muslim country. Yes, they are a theocracy, but they do have a good portion of they do have a huge portion of Christians there, and they have a huge portion of Jews there. So as much as they're trying to state that, oh, we support Jews and all these things, and it's anti-Semitic to insult Israel, and we need to support Jews, well, Israel actually supports the eradication of Iran. Well, when you do that, you're actually supporting the eradication of Jews, and that's not exactly something that you should be supporting. When if you support Jews that actually have the right to exist. Now, the Jews that are in Iran are actually not Zionist, and that's where the whole thing breaks down, and there's a whole big fight behind that. And that's where there tends to be a whole big issue, is they don't believe themselves as this supremacist group, and they believe that they can live in peace with other people, and they don't believe that they're above others. That's really where Zionism comes from. It doesn't believe on the idea that they're above others, and when you have a non-Zionist person. Anti-Zionism does not mean you hate a group of people. It just doesn't. It just means that you do not hold the belief that that Jews are the supreme, that they're the supreme beings on earth. Zionism would hold that belief, that they're the chosen people and the only chosen people, and that everybody else is beneath them. And if you hold any idea that of any type of personal equality, you should hold that as being garbage. And this is where, when we find a lot of what Trump is doing, he's essentially just handing over a lot of his presidency to basically pretty much Saudi Arabia and Israel, which their PACs are obviously CARE and AIPAC, respectively. And when you basically hand it over to this is basically the whole problem to begin with. And he thinks he's basically doing this, and this was the whole problem with politics to begin with, is when they're not doing the bidding of the actual country. And you should be doing the bidding of an actual country, and and countries want sovereignty. They don't want to be bought off by other countries outside of it. And when they're talking about, oh, Trump, oh, he's owned by Russia, no, that wasn't the problem. if we're talking about any problems right now with it, in the first term with it, he wasn't having this. In the first previous to the election, he wasn't having this issue because they didn't expect him to win. Now we're talking that with Sheldon Adelson, he's having these issues, and this is a big problem. And we're noticing this huge problem now that he's trying to become buddy because his son-in-law has his family ties with Netanyahu, and he's trying to become buddy with Israel. Now, it's probably going to help Netanyahu get reelected, but what's going to hurt in the end with this is if he's going to get reelected, because people are not going to take too kindly when he's basically continuing what everybody else has done. And if there's any legitimate person out there, I do not consider Bill Weld to be legitimate. Bill Weld is basically is another neocon, and they're not going to consider him as being legitimate. And they're not, because that was essentially what tanked the Libertarian run in the last election in 2016. And they're not going to essentially consider that as legitimate. What's going to have to be legitimate is someone who's actually going to run, who's actually going to show that they're going to be pro-liberty. Now, it depends on what the Democrats are going to offer. Now, if the Democrats are going to go full-in social justice warrior and all that other garbage, they're not going to win, because frankly people aren't going to tolerate it. And the only one I see as actually a legitimate option for them is Tulsi Gabbard. Now, we know this because we look at her ability to follow the Constitution. She is by far number one, and she's the only one that's actually preaching things that are being anti-war and being on the idea of being pro-liberty. Now, economically, she needs a lot of work, and she's very, very bad in that department. But when it comes to other areas with it, she has a lot of benefits. Now, if she were to be having her hands tied on the economic end with Congress, I think that we could find a lot of points that people could agree upon. But I think overall with it, I think she's going to do a lot better than a lot of other people. Now, when it comes down to what we have out there is it depends what she wants to actually run with. Now, if she tries to run with one of the other people out there, then it's going to be bad. If she tends to want to run with someone else in the field, someone else that's not running, it depends on what she ends up grabbing, and that will determine on how the success she has. Now what she's going to have to do is she's going to have to basically go on her ideas and be very, very strong in that. Because basically she's going to be going against someone like Kamala Harris, most likely, and on the Democratic side, and the Clinton machine, who's going to back Kamala Harris. And I think that's almost a given, because Kamala Harris is very, very Clinton-esque in her whole career and what she actually backs, with Kamala Harris really backing the war on drugs and what it calls just trying to change now to become popular, just as Clinton is. And I think that you're going to find a very the Clinton machine tending to throw all their weight behind her. Now, this is what she's going to have to basically contend with, and a person that's head of the DNC that is going to try to back whoever the Clintons want. Now, that's going to make it very, very difficult. Now, in the Libertarian end, who knows what's going to happen with that, because I've heard talks of Justin Amash, and that would really help things, but he's kind of tossing up question marks whether he's going to run or not, and that's going to make things very, very iffy. And even if so Trump is going to when it comes to things, Trump's going to have money with it, but his heart is, we could tell that his heart is not in this anymore. It hasn't been in it for a few months now, and he's just really kind of walking through the motions. And this is what we need to realize, is he's kind of half-assing it right now, because he's not exactly doing what he needs to be doing. He's bringing in people that are, he's letting the budget explode. He's not exactly paying attention when it comes to the actual foreign policy. He's letting people who are actually full-on neoconservatives take care of foreign policy. He's letting basically John Bolton give him all of the information on intelligence, and not taking an active role in this when it comes to other things. So he's more focused on giving his speeches, and it seems like he's just totally checked out. And it seems like the basic impact of all of the media coverage for a couple of years, it seems like that kind of weighed him down, and it seems like he just kind of cashed out. And he just was like, I'm just not interested in this anymore, but he wants to kind of say, well, I'll do a second term because everybody else does it. But who knows if he can actually go through, because he's going to have to go through these debates. And that's what's going to cause a lot of issues when it comes to the actual debates of whether he's going to do it. He's probably going to try to bring up a lot of slogan type of stuff, and who knows if it's really going to work him through. Because what pushed him through last time is these pro-liberty voters that kind of pushed him over the edge. Well, now he doesn't have those. He's not going to get those people, because he's trying to pander to a voting class that's really tends to vote Democrat regardless of what he does. And that's this Jewish voting bloc. This Jewish voting bloc tends to vote hardcore Democrat no matter what he does. And he needs to realize that by going in this direction, he's irritating the voting bloc that caused him to win. And he needs to go after more of the pro-liberty people and kind of be a little more hard on those stances, regardless of what groups he angers. Because he's going to he needs to anger more of these neocons out there, piss them off, and that will actually get a lot more people on his side, and start kicking out some of these neocons, start kicking out Bolton, start kicking out Pompeo, start kicking out Gina Haspel. Kick these people out, because Gina Haspel was the right-hand person of people like Brennan. That was Brennan's kind of hand-picked person. And when you start to go with all these people that Brennan wants, that they're like Brennan wanted for the CIA, and when you go with all these other people, and he put in an FBI director that was essentially working essentially for all the people in the bureaucracy, when he puts in a attorney general that essentially is on the page of one of the people that actually started the payment for the actual dossier, and all of these things like this, when he gets an actual national security advisor that voted for his rival, and was also another person that continued the payments of the dossier. You're not going to get a team that's going to be on your side. These are going to be people who are completely against you, and then when you kind of turn against these people who are trying to cut the budget and do things constitutionally, you start to yell at them and say, oh, they're against you. Guess what? You're going to essentially go downhill, and you're going to lose the election. That's kind of what caused the crisis during the midterms, because you kind of irritated a lot of those people off. Then it's going to only continue and get worse in 2020, because you're going to lose that election because of what you've done. And this is going to be less about the economy and more about the actual cause of what ended up happening for what he ended up doing with irritating his voters, his voting base. And I think we can actually claim that because of what ended up happening. And I think what they're going to have to do is the GOP is going to have to restructure again and actually get someone, instead of going on a lot of empty promises, they need someone who can actually go in and grab something that is going to be someone who has a little bit of experience, does not grab someone from the John Hay Initiative and get someone like Rand Paul. This is who they needed from the start, and they need someone in there like that that can actually kind of grab the bull by the horns, get through, and they need to get behind him with it. Don't go after, if you see a guy with the John Hay Initiative backing, do not go after them whatsoever, because they're only trouble. And this is something where this group is designed to be trouble, and they've controlled Washington D.C. foreign policy for God knows how many years, and they've ruined the actual world, and they've designed it this way because they believe in a liberal foreign policy perspective. Basically, they believe in this utopia of basically blowing up the world and reshaping it. And the only result is you create more and more war, and this is what they've done since the original progressive era, since the late 1800s. And they've done this constantly, and this is what ends up happening. And it's just gotten worse and worse ever since they've gotten more and more emboldened. And you need to kind of kick these people out and tell them how wrong they are. And that this is something that needs to actually happen. And I think we're going to learn a big lesson of what happens when you get someone who was initially bright enough to not take them on with the John Hay Initiative with Trump, but Trump was not bright enough to say no after he gets in office, because they're going to keep suggesting these John Hay Initiative people, being it like through Fox News or through one of these other groups. You're going to get people like Sebastian Gorka trying to suggest, oh, bring on these people, bring on those people, because they know what they're really doing. And you're going to get all these people that are going to basically say, oh, these John Hay Initiative people, they've been doing these things for a long time, and they know exactly what they're doing. No, they don't. They're actually complete and utter morons. And they've essentially ruined the world. And you need to understand that this is how you actually destroy an actual world itself. And what you need to do is go in the opposite direction. This is something where we can actually get this done very easily. And what we need to do is we need to actually start eliminating some of these people out there that are doing this. And if he wants to actually get to something that's going to get him to win, I would say number one is get rid of John Bolton. John Bolton is trouble. He's been trouble ever since the start, and I don't know what proposed him to actually bring in a moron like that when he could not pass an actual vote to be the assistant Secretary of State position, when he was basically told you're not going to get him through and it's not going to happen because you don't have the actual votes. It should kind of ring right there that this man is trouble, and he's never been able to actually pass a legitimate vote, and that should have been a little bit of a key right there. And ever since he actually came there, this man has actually been in trouble. This man actually ruined the North Korean summit, and he was trying to do this from the start because he doesn't like to be bogged down by by peace agreements. You have Pompeo. Pompeo is actually another one. He should have never even been brought into CIA either. CIA has actually been found within recent time of actually been doing a bunch of shady activities within the recent months as well. Within the recent years as well, of doing a bunch of shady activities. We've even seen with the and then under the Pentagon, within the last like 5 or so years, we've seen just shy of 10,000 whistleblower filings, and that should be a little bit of an actual key. It's actually 9,950, I believe it is. It's something like that, and it's so astronomical that you could not even believe this. And we're talking, and that these are basically just solely on economic waste. And when people try to say, "Oh, there's no waste at the Pentagon," well, you wouldn't be having all these whistleblowers that are showing that the Pentagon's actually putting things in there that don't exist to actually account for things that aren't there. And this is just showing you right there that when you have these neoconservative think tanks like AEI trying to actually cover up for the Pentagon, which is just a bunch of liars about what's going on, and that this is basically our biggest that this is more boondoggles, and we could see that we could drop down all of our defense spending down to about 250 billion. And I've already discussed this multiple times. We don't need all of this money. We can actually drop it all the way down to that 250 billion amount. We can start doing a lot of different changes to the actual budget that would actually be very, very productive. He could have kept his promise with auditing the Federal Reserve instead of basically becoming their best friend and saying, "Oh, we still need to monetize this debt." You actually look at the debt clock when he came in, and you see that it was at we're talking on this day in 2016, it was about just shy of 19.5 trillion. You go to today and it's over 22 trillion. So he keeps adding more and more and more money to it. Basically, when we around when he's expected to if he wins, when he's expected to leave office, we're talking it's probably going to be somewhere near $28 trillion, if not more. And that's going to be insane. Where debt per taxpayer is going to be over $200,000, and debt per citizen is going to be over $80,000. And that's not exactly where you want to be going. And that's showing that he's going in the opposite direction. And this is not what people brought him into. They brought him in to be doing. He's actually he could actually be going in the opposite direction. The very easy thing to do: let all spending expire. Basically say that we're gonna basically allow a short period of time for all voting on the 12 spending bills. We're gonna take 2 7-day weeks. We're basically going to be doing 2 bills a day through each house, and that'll be Sunday through Saturday, and we're going to be going through each one. We're going to be making sure on the day section, we're going to be making sure to get rid of all of the useless spending, and on the night we're going to be doing voting on making sure that make sure we get enough votes to pass each one. And then they're going to pass it as that, and then they're going to make sure that they have like a preliminary vote. that they're going to pass each one. Now, they're going to go through and they're going to make sure that they can pass through each one. And then they'll go through each one, and they can do a couple each day, go through each house, make sure that they can at least get make sure that they can pass well past 60 votes. And they're going to be pulling out things from each thing. They're going to be basically making sure that they can get that they have to get at least 60 votes on each individual piece that's in there. And if they can't, then that thing has to be stripped from funding. And this is the way that they go forward. Now, what this is going to do, this is going to essentially remove a lot of things from the actual budget. And it's going to make people actually have to commit to certain things, and the end result will be a budget that will actually be friendly to both sides, because it'll be a bipartisan in a way that both people can actually govern. Now, you're actually governing in a way that it works, because you're not just basically continuing everything through and adding more on top and saying we're either going to go up or down. You're basically saying, does this thing survive or not? And you're saying if it does, you're going to cut it out. And you're basically going to go, you're basically going to be saying, are we going to keep this or not? And what's going to happen is you're going to remove a lot of garbage. And it's going to be removing a lot of things from the budget. And you're going to realize in the end that you're going to be left with very, very little. Because when you start doing that, you're not going to have the time for any horse trading, because it's just going to be straight up voting for what's best for your constituents, what's best for your state, and what you feel on the Constitution. And it's going to eliminate a lot of this, and you're going to realize that in the end, people are going to realize in the end that you're going to get a slimmed down budget, and when you start dealing with the revenue that comes in, you're probably going to be able to take close to $1 trillion out of that, if not more, out of your out of the actual money that you've actually built up. And if not more, I mean, you might be able to take up to a couple trillion out from the actual budget. And you're going to realize within time that when you start buying back more and more loans, you're going to realize that more and more money is going to be saved, and that's going to start making more and more money freed up, and within time the money is going to go down, the money can be returned out to the people, and that's going to raise the amount of revenue to the private sector, and it's going to be very, very positive for the actual communities, because you're going to have a lot more charity being done for the people who are impoverished. And that's going to be something that's going to be good, and that could be something that Trump could work on. But the fact is, he doesn't. He does this little thing of, oh my God, we need all this money for the military. He buys into all that garbage, and he buys into all these other things that his advisors are telling him, and he buys into the idea that we actually need civilian intelligence, when our country has had civilian intelligence for maybe at most about a third of its to maybe about 40% of its lifetime, and we know that we do not need civilian intelligence, and we could essentially eliminate 100% of it. And what civilian intelligence has actually done has actually been no worthwhile for the actual country, and has actually destabilized the world, and it's actually done nothing but violate the Constitution. We can actually start eliminating things, such as if you eliminate the war on drugs, you can actually save even more money from the actual budget. Once they eliminate the war on drugs, if they do that within legislation, it essentially means the DEA can no longer exist. If you start to do more legislation to bring in more freedom, you're going to start realizing that you can start cutting out more agencies, and the more agencies you start stripping, the more that you could actually start saving in money on the budget. And and the more you don't do this, the more money is actually saved. And once that money is saved, you're going to realize you can actually pull more money off. And once that money is pulled and you put it toward buying back loans on the budget, buying back loans from that are actually currently outstanding, you'll realize that it would actually help out in the future, because that's actually interest you're currently paying. Now that would actually lower the actual interest on each year as the actual debt keeps going down. Now you'd actually learn that with it. Now if someone goes to the debt clock, now the debt clock does not change no matter what. Now the actual figures on the debt clock does not change no matter what type of economics you believe in. Doesn't matter if you're Austrian, Keynesian, side supplier, or MMT. It doesn't really matter. Those figures are still owned by the actual government, which are in the government, which is in the United States citizens' names. And it doesn't matter which form of economics you believe in. Now, what needs to happen with it is we need an actual president that's actually, and Congress that's willing to actually stand up and say, we're willing to let the spending expire, and then after the spending expires, we're willing to actually reauthorize spending of what's ever non-controversial. Now, this isn't a partisan issue. This is actually basically saying, okay, whichever spending is not controversial, we're going to reauthorize. Now, this means that both sides are going to have a lot of cuts. And you're going to have a huge amount of cuts from both sides. This means the military is probably going to be stuck with only defending the U.S. and its territories, and then on the which is going to affect these neocons. And on the left is going to have to realize that it's going to have to be private charity that's going to have to deal with giving money out, and the government's welfare programs are going to have to end. Public aid is going to have to end. It's basically, if there's going to be any, it's going to have to be for only Social Security and for retirees and for the disabled. And that's just going to have to be what it ends as, and it's going to have to be cut at that. And then when it comes down to everything else, we're going to have to start being very, very tight, because we have a debt that's not manageable anymore, and we can't keep adding to it. And if you look at historically with it, it really goes down to central banking. And this is something in which we need to understand that Trump, by not keeping one of his promises to audit the Federal Reserve, this is really something in which he's really made a problem much, much worse, and almost turning tail by saying he's willing to consider the idea of another round of quantitative easing within the last week or so. This is essentially going in the opposite direction. I mean, this is something that he admits that the economy is a bubble now, because if he doesn't admit that that the economy is stable on its own to run without loose monetary policy, that he needs to admit that this whole thing was a bubble to begin with. And this is something he stated it was a bubble before he came into office, but then all of a sudden he let his ego take over, and he went in the opposite direction, saying, "Oh, it's because of my election." Well, it wasn't because of it was only a minor case because of Trump's election. A lot of that was still because of the impact of the bubble. There was only a minor case of that, and it was still rising up because of this bubble. And that was only a small case of it. Now that the bubble is getting a little bit too big, and we're coming up to the point in which it's going to pop very soon, and someone's going to be taking the blame for this. And most likely it's going to be the president. It's usually the president and the House of Representatives. Now what's going to be interesting is, because that's split right now, it's going to be interesting in how this thing's going to work out, because it's usually a mix of both. Now traditionally we've had it to be where that's been controlled by one party within the last case, but this is going to be something in which we're going to see where you're going to see it split, so it's going to be interesting how it actually comes about. And I'm probably just going to end it here with it. Make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share it all around to your friends and everywhere else publicly. Make sure if you can't donate to my Twitter, make sure that, or to my to my Patreon page. Make sure that if you can't donate, make sure to share it to someone else who can. That's about it, and I will see you guys probably tomorrow. Bye, everyone.